Awesome, thank you so much for coming. This talk is Mentoring the Way to Diverse and Inclusive Workplace. My name is Alex Millatmal. I have my Twitter profile up here. Also, sorry about any font sizes. There was a change of things kind of last minute, but again, all these are online. And my pronouns are she, her. I'm a developer at Newzella in New York City. We are an education tech company that's focused on promoting literacy and helping teachers differentiate their lesson planning to make things easier for those folks who are working in the K-12 education space. You can find me at, again, this like garbled string of characters. It actually says Halfgan in Nebraska, and that's on Twitter or GitHub or just around the internet. So what are we talking about today and why? The description of this talk reads, do you work at a company that's difficult for juniors or not set up for them? Do you also care about diversity and inclusion for underrepresented groups? Do you stay awake at night thinking that these things might be incompatible but like not really sure how to articulate why? And that's pretty much exactly what I want to try to talk to you about today. I've suffered through this very situation, and I'm sure many of you have too. And I want to reassure you that the gap that you might feel between the kinds of supports that you think are needed in the workplace and what you're actually receiving, that gap is real. It's not just in your head. And so I'd like to make the argument to you that the tenets of good mentorship and the tenets of good D&I strategy are really like, they overlap, and we can think about these things in service of one another. If you're looking for the things that were left over from the last speaker, they're just like right here on the table. It's all chill here. I'm like enjoying that about this conference a lot. Awesome. We would never like let you go without it. So first, let's set up some expectations for about who this talk is for. This talk hopefully can be for everybody. In general, I'm hoping that for all of you who are already keyed into these issues, that from this talk you'll get a new way to frame this conversation about advocating for these kinds of workplace supports. I hope to show managers and team leads small actions that can hopefully make a big difference in the inclusivity and happiness of their teams. Junior engineers, especially those of you who are from underrepresented identities, will get an idea about like what to look for in companies. And leaders who are ready to move beyond D&I 101 will hopefully get some ideas about initiatives that they can foster and support at their own workplace. So during this talk, we'll talk about the relationship between mentorship programs and issues of inclusion, belonging, and retention for marginalized folks. But because you're aware of like a lot of the underlying issues for the premise of this talk, there are some things that we are not going to talk about. We are not going to delve into minutia around who is underrepresented in tech. We're not going to talk about D&I through any kind of fiscal lens. And we're definitely not even going to talk about the need for diversity and inclusion efforts. That is all taken as a given. That's kind of the space we're in, and I'm really stoked to be talking about this stuff here. So what are we going to talk about? We'll start with the why. Why am I the person talking to you, and why this combination of mentorship and D&I? Then we'll discuss what efforts work for each of these initiatives and see how they intersect. Next, we'll talk about how you might implement a mentorship that serves diversity and inclusion efforts, including conversations about what not to do. And finally, we'll talk about how you can convince your company to adopt such a program. So why am I talking to you about all of this? I'd like to start with a story. I'd like to tell you about two different companies that I encountered during my first years in tech and explained how they helped shape the ideas for this talk. So when I started out in web development, I graduated from a code school in Omaha, and I was really fortunate to go on to work at the company that hosted that very code school. And in a lot of ways, the company seemed a little bit impossible. And what I mean by that is that at one point, my former boss and I had the realization that we were the brownest tech company in Omaha, Nebraska. We were really tiny, but 80% of our technical employees were people of color, and 50% of our employees overall were women. It was something that we were really proud of, and it frankly took effort to craft that. There was another thing that the company did that made that mentorship that happened there look really easy. They had a practice of both retaining code school graduates to work as consultant devs, but also having members of the consultancy teach at the code school. So there really was this expectation of learning and teaching that was baked into the DNA of the company. Having teachers as my bosses was a really big advantage for me as a then junior engineer. I was constantly getting tasks that were appropriately challenging for me. I didn't stay at that company forever though, and while I was on the search for my first fully technical gig, I encountered another kind of company, and it's the kind that doesn't have to go beyond the status quo. While I was searching in a small market like Omaha, I was really shocked both at the lack of diversity of the kinds of jobs that were available to me as a junior. So many of the jobs looked the same to one another, but also at the lack of difference within the company themselves. So often their technical staffs were almost entirely homogeneous. This isn't news to many people. At the same time though, when I'd interview with a few of these companies that I thought were doing something exciting and working on really interesting technical problems, I'd hear the refrain of, "We don't have the capacity to support your learning right now." So I would look around me and I'd see the classmates who I graduated code school with and the students that I taught, and I would see a workforce that looked really different than the engineers who were making some of these hiring decisions. I would see a larger representation of marginalized races, genders, and sexualities in these junior engineers than in the Omaha tech industry as a whole. So I'd really wonder how it's possible for the industry to grow and to change if all of the difference I was seeing was among these newbies, and that if the companies that could have any of their pick of new hires weren't making room for both them and for their learning. I wondered what would happen if this workforce, what would happen to them if these star companies, the ones with like really shiny offices and great perks, of course, but also the ones who are working on really cutting edge technical problems or the ones that have the best benefits in town. What would happen to these folks if these companies were leaving them behind? And so through this back-to-back exposure to companies with really different approaches to skill building and learning on the one hand and diversity and inclusion on the other, I kind of started thinking to myself, maybe these two things have some kind of relationship to each other. And so I'd like to pose the question to you. What if strong mentorship at an organization begets diversity and inclusion? When surveying what office place initiatives are effective, both in terms of mentorship, but also D&I and retention, we see major areas of overlap. So how can we start thinking about building a good culture of one in service of the other? What would it look like to endorse mentorship that's designed from the offset to be supportive of underrepresented employees? And what if connecting and advancing those workers was a key component of our corporate D&I strategy? How might this framing of mentorship and D&I being hand in hand really serve us? Could it drive more empathetic mentorship, maybe more effective mentorship? Could the business case for solid D&I strategy be made more tangible by wrapping that work under the banner of mentorship and skill building? These are some of the things I'm hoping to talk with you all about today. And I'd like to start by breaking down what constitutes like good mentorship and good diversity and inclusion efforts with the goal of seeing how they intersect. So we'll start off by talking about techniques that work well to support and retain employees with underrepresented identities. The techniques that you see here on the screen, hopefully they're like somewhat readable, are probably very familiar to you, and I'm going to speak more in depth about a few of them. So starting off, let's talk about recruiting processes. It's important, of course, to think about where you're posting your job descriptions, what networks you're leveraging, and what kind of language you're using for your posting. Both, of course, to attract the candidates that you want, but also to make sure not to alienate folks you might not be thinking about. There are services out there. One that I have in mind and linked at the end of these notes looks specifically at the axis of gender and makes sure that the language that you use in your posting doesn't have unintentionally alienating gendered language. Another place that I really like to recommend for job postings is a site called Key Values. I'm not sure if anyone here has heard of it before. But to post a role, companies have to fill out a profile that outlines their values. So there's things, of course, that are like actively practices inclusion or good for junior devs, but there's also phrases like has a high quality code base, flexible work arrangements, and engineering-driven culture. And what happens is that candidates can then go and search for companies that align with their highest prioritized values. I really love this because it helps us hiring decision makers start to think about these values right alongside one another. And then it also really helps us start to think about the positions and the candidates who are applying for them holistically, which can help lead us toward a practice of values-based interviewing. So I'd like to speak also a little bit to the idea of recommendations as a means of recruitment. I recently had this like pretty compelling conversation with an executive team leader at Newzella where I was asking them how we might think about fairly compensating us underrepresented employees who help bring other people to the table. And they mentioned the tool of referral bonuses for employees to both incentivize and compensate them for that effort. And I totally agree that this can be a great tool, but it's a strategy that kind of cuts both ways, because if you're in a company that already has employees with a lot of overlapping identities, that recommendation and referral thing can just compound the homogeneity. And so if any of you have ideas about how to like better compensate ourselves for doing that work, please let's talk about it after this, because I'd love to start working at that problem. So I'd also like to discuss affinity groups at a company. Importantly, these groups shouldn't just be about getting together to talk about being a blank employee at a company, but they should also be a space that allows you to have social interactions and do relationship building, especially across departments, because that's really like the basis from which your conversations about your experience in the workplace get their legs and can actually take action. The most effective affinity groups act like caucuses and have a representative who is responsible for bringing up concerns to upper management and working on them to actually enact solutions. Of course, in order for this caucus model to work, it needs to be dedicated and regularly occurring time that leadership invites feedback from the group. So clear definition around performance evaluation and advancement helps remove unspoken or even totally unrecognized bias come review time. Researchers at Stanford consulted with various companies about their review procedures, and they found out that when managers began applying consistently previously agreed upon criteria, there was a reduction of the gender gaps in ratings. So previously, men had been overrepresented in the top tier for review, and women were overrepresented in the middle tier. But once they started applying this agreed upon criteria, that overrepresentation was eliminated completely. So, of course, who defines the criteria, where and when it's made accessible to employees, all of that is a key part of crafting something agreed upon and transparent. So even just having these clear definitions of roles and responsibilities gets named as a key concern among us. Having those codified helps employees who have been historically disenfranchised point to clear language around their authority and contribution. So are you being looked at as having a scope of ownership and responsibility? Are you in the meetings that you're supposed to be in? Literally, are you getting seats at the table where business decisions are being made? So we get it, right? At this point, especially, we're at this conference where people who already care about these issues, you might all be thinking to yourself that this is really obvious. But unfortunately, it's not, especially for people who hold power. So research by the Boston Consulting Group, which is a multinational management consulting firm, found stark differences in the perceived importance of workplace practices when they are ranked by members of an underrepresented group versus the dominant group in question. We can talk about formal sponsorship. I like to think about sponsorship as kind of like beefed up super mentorship. Sponsors are people who work as accomplices in your advancement and ultimately are accountable themselves for your growth. There's lots of work out there about the differences between mentorship and sponsorship and why it's especially relevant to a lot of us here today. And I've linked some of that at the end of the slides. So formal sponsorship is ranked 14th out of 31 inclusion initiatives by people of color, but it was ranked 28th by white men. Representation in leadership is consistently ranked as important by folks with underrepresented identities. I know I'm not the only one here who, when I'm applying for a job, like combs through the list of executive directors and advisory board members. And when I'm doing that, I'm looking for something specific. Are there people steering the ship who look like me or who look like my mentors and role models? Is there a model for advancement at this company, or at least a chance of having an ally in this leadership board? This was ranked 5th out of 31 initiatives by women and 17th by men. Having a bias-free day-to-day, the idea that you might want to work without getting jokes thrown at you about your identity, or make sure that the meetings that are happening on your team are fair, as far as who's invited to those. That was ranked 5th out of 31 initiatives by LGBTQ employees and 15th by straight men. So not only are these numerical gaps really stark, but the real-world application of this misunderstanding is also really devastating. It could look like requests from an affinity group leader that goes like totally unheard by HR, or it could look like an executive leadership team investing in initiatives that they think are really, really great, but are totally out of line with what employees actually want. So we've talked about the methods of ensuring success for underrepresented folks, and we also uncovered how those ideas like aren't obvious to all people, especially those who traditionally hold power and authority. So keeping those points in mind, let's talk about some of the techniques that can help support and level up junior engineers. So the breadth of what we'll cover is like on this slide, and we'll go deeper into each of them. So again, we see recruitment processes here, but the issues that we think about are different when we look at it specifically through the lens of supporting junior engineers. Is your company being transparent about the needs that they have for a particular job posting? And are they accurately detailing the asks of the engineer? Later on in the interview process, is the structure of your interview actually reflecting and addressing those needs? And is it potentially catered specifically to this position? Does the process manage to remain, human and friendly? I'm an advocate for an admittedly a kind of radical and not easy endeavor. I think that at every step of the process, the candidate should receive feedback from the interview. If a company doesn't want to move forward with a candidate, HR and hiring managers should really work together to craft actionable feedback so that the candidate has tangible ways that they can grow to become qualified in the future, but at the very least, just more information to analyze why this might have not been the right role or company for them at the time. The company should also consider the role itself. If you're hiring a junior engineer, is the role designed for them, like an apprenticeship or a clearly defined entry-level position? In the position, is the structure of their work or the expectation of their output meaningfully different from that of a mid-level engineer? Are there clear expectations in place about how they move from this role to mid-level and grow within this company? At RailsConf 2018, Megan Tew did a fantastic job of outlining how she designed and piloted an apprenticeship program that accounted for all of these concerns at CallRail. And I've linked the talk at the resources, again, at the end of the slide. So I'm not going to go into details today about onboarding for junior engineers, but once a junior engineer has been hired and onboarded and is starting to settle into their role and responsibility at a company, learning groups can be a really great source of support for them. But I'd like to invite us to think beyond this kind of like lunch and learn model for a moment and think about what other spaces, if any, are at your company that support learning. Having these, ones that are like consistently and constantly available, can really give junior engineers a space to ask questions and demonstrate leadership, especially if the groups are for peer-to-peer learning. Even better is if all levels of employees are modeling this learning behavior in a public place for like kind of department-wide communications, like Slack channels. So the seemingly possible in code school from the beginning of the talk, they had a rule that no tech question could go in a private channel. All of that learning had to happen out in the open. Apart from the kinds of informal relationships that might come up naturally between an engineer and their colleagues, having a formalized mentorship in place helps ensure that compensated time is being spent on measurable goals for an engineer. This could look like mentorship, which is like advice giving and knowledge sharing, or coaching a more experienced engineer, helping guide a junior to set those goals, but then also setting aside the time to maybe work through them with them. Or like the buffed up sponsorship that we talked about earlier, where a manager or lead helps the junior set the goals, recommends them for opportunities, and also is accountable for their progress. Developing clear expectations around growth, and particularly for junior engineers, is really helpful for identifying skills gaps. Done right, a standardized review process can help reframe juniorness into opportunities rather than any kind of skills deficit. And this helps lend a framework to the formalized mentorship we just discussed. So we've talked about individual techniques that can support junior engineers and techniques that can help support employees who are from marginalized groups, but I'd like to quickly talk about the intersection between the two. So, as it turns out, many great diversity and inclusion initiatives are also really great mentorship initiatives, and vice versa. Things like thoughtful and transparent recruiting processes, having groups of peers that have accountability toward one another and the company as a whole, having standard and clear review process, having definition of one's role, knowing exactly what you're accountable for, what your responsibilities are, and what other employees should come to you for. And also having some kind of formalized mentorship, having a pathway to folks in decision-making positions that happens on company time. So thinking about this overlap then, what would a mentorship program look like that has diversity and inclusion in mind? In this next section, we'll discuss how mentorship can and should embody the overlapping tenets we just talked about, as well as make a business case for this kind of mentorship. First though, I kind of want to take a break and talk about the fact that building this culture of mentorship is really hard work. It can be really easy for us to forget this as people who eat, breathe, and viscerally feel the need for this work in our everyday lives, but it does require effort. And it's easy for businesses to fall into a pattern of like saying that they're doing things that are good for juniors and good for marginalized folks without actually measuring if that's true. And it can be really hard for us in this room to hold up that mirror. How often do you hear the kind of defensive reaction, not at my workplace, like we're really intentional. But intent is only half of the picture, and all of us make mistakes. So to build a kind of picture of that, I want to talk to you about a company that like thinks that they have it right. This is the kind of company that is actually also kind of like almost the opposite of the problem that I had in Omaha. It's the one that has mastered how to talk the talk, but not a lot else. You might know something like this. It's the kind of company that hosts bias trainings or has a code of conduct posted on their wall, but where despite operating in a market like New York, there are no engineers of color or women engineers to be seen in the room. But there are white women in leadership, and the average tenure of an engineer is something like 6 or 7 years, which is pretty good. That's well above the industry average. So maybe if all of those employees can be happy there, you can be too. It's the kind of place with totally unstructured learning, where you might be sent to work on a task like learn Angular on your own, have no clear path to advance from one role to the next, receive conflicting advice about what to do to level up, and be put under the wing of mentors who are not receiving support and training of their own. Working at this kind of company, you might notice other trends over time. Somehow all of the juniors across hundreds of employees are women. Somehow it's only these junior women engineers who are left out of hiring discussions. Did any of you hear parts of your company or some aspects of your company culture in that description? I know I can hear parts of companies that I really love in that picture. So what do we do about it? If intent is only half of the picture, the other is sacrifice. Intention is really good, but it's sacrifice to redesign and change practices, to take time to survey and measure outcomes, and to make real investments in employees that gets us to building a truly special implementation of this kind of combined mentorship and support for marginalized workers. So let's talk about what such a program could be, starting from the very first introduction that a worker has with a company. Mentorship that prioritizes marginalized people in our industry should really begin during the interviews. I was surprised when I interviewed at Newzella that I received feedback at every step of the way. Not only was I receiving feedback from the company and the specific employees who interviewed me, but I was being asked to provide feedback myself about the process. Sacrifices totally had to be made here. The company had to give up some level of opacity and protection about their interview process in order to share out that feedback with me, and also show vulnerability and humility to accept feedback in return. It made very clear to me that Newzella had a strong culture of respect and knowledge sharing, and I was impressed that the perspectives of all of these different kinds of employees were valued enough to share out on behalf of the company. I think this shows that exemplifying good mentorship can happen as early on as initial conversations with a potential candidate. These kinds of mentorship should also place serious focus on developing the mentors in the equation. Being a mentee paired with an untrained mentor is a special kind of hell. It puts the mentee in the situation of having to manage up, which is work that's likely to go unrecognized come review time. And worse, if the mentee hasn't experienced good mentorship before, they might not even recognize the ways in which this mentorship is not serving them. At the end of the day, mentorship is a two-way street, and being a good mentor is a learned skill. My former boss, Samit Jain, has a talk where he talks about actionable steps to level up junior developers. And on its face, this is a talk about bringing juniors up to speed, but looked at another way, it's a discussion about how to develop mentorship as a practice in your workplace. And this happens through sacrificing time and space to form good habits. I've spoken already about the advantages of clear growth plans and accountability for both juniors and employees with marginalized identities. But I'd like to invite you to think about the person with the power in this equation, the mentor, for a moment. Have you ever seen a colleague become a better collaborator after working with a junior engineer? Maybe their commit messages are more descriptive, or they take more time to work through technical requirements before starting development. Mentorship is a leadership, and it is learned. Work being done on both sides of this equation should be considered and evaluated along clear growth objectives for both the mentor and the mentee, and be taken into account as a facet of each employee's growth and advancement at the company. This necessitates the sacrifice, of course, of taking the time and attention to outline and standardize what these objectives should be at your place of work, because it's going to be different for everybody. I'd like to shout out also, this mentorship should be happening on compensated time. I'm not advocating for only mentorship under a corporate umbrella. Really importantly, some of the best engineering relationships I've formed have been in very individualistic, nonprofit, and even anti-corporate spaces. But there's a need and a benefit for having these supports in the context of our work. And the scope of that mentorship should not be happening at happy hours or rock climbing gyms, but in the confines of our typical work week. The employee is doing work for the company, and hopefully, as we've talked about, goals of the mentorship are being defined by the company. Therefore, it's the responsibility of the company, and paid time must be allocated for it. Lastly, yes, this kind of mentorship should make space for reflection among peers, but I'd really like to invite us to rethink the peer group. Peer groups within an organization can be cut many different ways, and the point that I really want to drive home here is that new learnings get cemented when they're put into action through application. The groups where this application can be most impactful are not always the most obvious ones. For example, I once worked at a company that created a Slack channel for junior engineers, and it was kind of meant to be this peer-to-peer learning space. But because we were spread over different offices and projects, it wasn't actually an organic place to apply our knowledge or clarify our questions. They might have taken the time to think, or better yet, ask us junior engineers what kind of space we wanted and how we wanted to define the groups where we applied that learning. A Black woman junior engineers peers are not only other junior engineers, Black employees, or women employees. They could be other back-end developers or members of her pod or product team, stakeholders in the features that she's building, or employees that share her professional interests outside of the work that she's doing for the team. The more chances that she gets to share out her learnings and growth, the more that she gets to demonstrate and test those learnings, and the more that the mentorship pays dividends. So, fine, all of this sounds good, but getting buy-in can be really hard. So, how do we get management's seal of approval? What is the value to the company? By thinking about supporting underrepresented groups through mentorship initiatives, we can sell programs that are good for diversity and inclusion to our companies through making the business case for mentorship, which many see as having a clearer fiscal value than D&I strategies themselves. So for each item that we talked about as being a directive of this kind of mentorship program, we'll talk about a potential value proposition for the company. So beginning with the idea that this kind of mentorship should start early, we see that this kind of mentorship can build brand halo among candidates and reflect the company well outside of the business itself. We can also see that through the development of strong mentors, this kind of mentorship can help distribute management responsibilities. When you have lead engineers or team leads taking on some of the work of observing engineers' goals and making sure that there's a sense of inclusivity, belonging, and equity on their team, you free up higher level employees to think about the bird's eye view concerns of your engineering team and how they interact with other parts of the company. Because this kind of mentorship focuses on the development of both the mentor and the mentee, it really can build its own workforce. Mentorship is a learned skill, again, and therefore strong, disciplined, and studied mentorships beget strong, dedicated, and practiced mentors, reinforcing your program for the next batch of new hires. Because this mentorship is happening on compensated time, it can help distribute business knowledge. Because employees are learning on the job, you build skills in the context of their work rather than in the abstract or on a kind of toy problem. Accomplishing real business problems helps these employees gain authority in their day-to-day. And because this mentorship incorporates a cross-functional definition of the peer group, it can foster relationship building and belonging. When people are recognized for their expertise and given opportunities to wield that expertise in collaboration with their coworkers, you've created a really rare condition to bond over work under late capitalism, and that's a really special and unique thing. Okay, we made it. We talked about real life experiences that helped kind of spur this thought experiment about the combination of mentorship and diversity and inclusion efforts. And we reviewed key areas of focus for each of these kind of initiatives, covering why the supports aren't as obvious as they might seem and how they intersect. We discussed how you might implement a mentorship that serves these efforts, including a conversation about what kinds of thinking leads to common pitfalls. And we made a business case for such a framework. So altogether, I hope that this presentation has helped us start to think about what these efforts look like in our own places of work and what they look like in service of one another, and has given some ideas about how you might bolster these own efforts at your company. I really want to thank you for listening to the ideas in this talk. Again, I'm Alex Millatmal. I'm a developer at Newzella, and I'm happy to talk about any of this, as well as just generally my experience in engineering. You can find me at all this info here. I really quickly want to take a moment to thank some people who helped me develop this talk. I think it's really easy to get up here and spew information and seem like I have things figured out, but a lot of this was in development with other people. So Neha Batra is an advisor for this very conference, and she helped me think about how to reframe things in terms of this audience. Jennifer, too, is a wonderful person who's involved in the Rails community, and she helped encourage me to write this talk. Shannon Jackson is a manager based in Omaha, and she reviewed these while she was 8 months pregnant, so that speaks for itself. Catherine Kosha is just my go-to proofreader. She's a music therapist. Joshua Howe was a coworker of mine in a really toxic work environment who encouraged me to think about these issues and to talk about these issues. Smeet Jain is a former boss who I think his concerns as an engineering manager really helped me as a foil to my perspective as an engineer. And Anton Backer is one of my engineering managers who worked like really diligently and critiqued a lot of this talk for me. All my Newsela colleagues have been great about listening to these ideas and thinking about how we can start implementing them and putting them into action at our company. So again, resources are all up here with nice handy links. And I just want to thank you again. These slides will be in the speaker slides channel, and they're also already up in a different form at my website. So thank you.